Thank you very much, Scott, for that kind introduction. Yes, I am a Blue Devil, loved or hated, but never ignored. It is a privilege to be here this morning. I have proudly served, Scott got the date slightly wrong. I came to the department in 2009 as part of the Obama administration, and I will tell you I have proudly served our president for the last 7.5 years, and equally as proud of the accomplishments that we have made over that course of time. And I want to spend some time later in my remarks speaking about it, but I will, just to the passion that Scott mentioned, tell you, and I have said this publicly and it's ended up in articles even, but I really do think I have the greatest job in the federal government, and potentially the greatest job ever, because every day I get to come to work and work with owners and operators of our critical infrastructure in managing what has really become a very complex and dynamic risk environment. No one day is the same when you look at the range of issues that we deal with, but equally important, the people, my colleagues that I go to work with every day are so passionate and committed and dedicated and selfless to executing and implementing our mission. And I've known that January 20th is coming for about 7.5 years, and I have to tell you it's bittersweet. I'm not really ready to walk out the door, but I do take a lot of solace in the fact that I have a phenomenal leadership team in place in infrastructure protection, and I know that I'm turning what I call my baby over to folks like Scott, and it will be in good hands. So thank you very much, Scott. I also want to thank Chuck and Mary and Kelly really for the fantastic partnership that we have. We've come so far over the last several years, and it is really a joy to be able to participate in these types of events. I also want to thank the members of the InfraGard NCR chapter who have brought to life the intents and themes of this year's National EMP SIG sessions at the DuPont Summit. The work that InfraGard does, not only across the country, but the NCR chapter, the EMP SIG, and also the International Council on Systems Engineering, all the work that you've done leading up to today's event, including hosting what transpired yesterday, the review of the Powering Through Planning Guide, which is intended to help us think about how we are prepared and plan for these types of events, is so critical. So thank you. I know that you all have day jobs, and grateful that you come together to focus on what I call these types of kind of unbounded events, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. But I can't tell you how important sessions like today are, because at the end of the day, we are living, as I mentioned, in what is a rapidly evolving and equally dynamic risk environment. And when you look back 12 years ago, as we started to stand up at the department and what we were really focused on at the end of the day, which was largely, counterterrorism and mitigating the potential threat of a terrorist-directed group, Al-Qaeda, and how we evolved. I think that really speaks to the dynamic risk environment that we live in. Yes, we are still concerned about Al-Qaeda, but we are also equally concerned about this terrorist-inspired environment that we live in, the rise of ISIL, their use of social media and the internet to recruit, to train, to arm, and to direct our adversaries, those who have grievances against the West. And equally important to say, you don't have to travel overseas to fight with us anymore. You can stay here at home. The battlefield can be at home, and you can pick up, most recently, a car and a knife at a location of your liking and perpetrate your attack. It's a very real world that we are living in right now. We've seen it in Orlando, we saw it at Ohio State, at San Bernardino, and all around the country. As Scott alluded to, we have seen the rise of cyber threats, vandals, thugs, thieves, saboteurs, all who understand the importance of our critical infrastructure and who are looking to gain footholds to steal our intellectual property, and who are using cyberspace to perpetrate their attacks. We have an infrastructure that is aging and failing. Much of our nation's critical infrastructure was built nearly 100 years ago, some of it more than 150 years ago. I guarantee you the people who built that infrastructure never could have imagined the world that we live in today, or accounted for the population shifts and the urbanization and the incredible ecosystem that we have built that powers what we do every day. We are dealing with the emergence of technology and things like position, navigation, and timing that have become ubiquitous across our critical infrastructures. And yet, for PNT, we rely on a single source, the Global Positioning System, which every day is increasingly at risk, and we have to think about how we create resiliency and redundancy in GPS. And then equally important, these bigger unbounded events, things that frankly I never imagined coming into the department, the risk of solar storms, GMD, and the reason that we're here today, electromagnetic pulses. I think all of this is made more complex by the fact that we are increasingly interconnected and interdependent. When you think about this ecosystem that is critical infrastructure and how much our water systems rely on the internet, rely on electricity, rely on all of these important lifelines sectors. And you can go through each sector and point to the critical dependencies and other lifelines. Again, we've built a very sophisticated and complex environment where a disruption, not only in one sector, but at one particular asset can have cascading impacts across multiple sectors. And so when you take an event, and whether it is a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, whether it is a space weather event, or whether it is an EMP disruption, these kind of massive regional or national type of events, you begin to understand and realize the types of impacts and consequences that we have and why we have to come together as a community. Private sector, the federal government, state and local governments, and other entities. Not only to understand the risks that we're dealing with, but to think through how are we best prepared. And that's really, at the end of the day, the mission of the Office of Infrastructure Protection, is to help owners and operators of critical infrastructure working with our state and local governments to manage this very complex risk environment. We're not in the business of telling people how to do things. We're in the business of supporting them. We're a convener and a coordinator where we bring people together, ask difficult questions, share information, and again, work towards ensuring that we are better postured to handle both the routine but the unbounded. I want to talk a little bit about what the federal government is doing to address EMP threats and hazards. And I do think that this is really illustrative of the role that the federal government plays in working with owners and operators of critical infrastructure to ensure the security and resilience of this ecosystem. Chuck mentioned some of the work that we have done on space weather. Again, this has been one of both the most surprising but most gratifying efforts that I have participated in serving as the co-chair of the Space Weather Operations Research and Mitigation, or SWARM, task force. And I continue, or at least I will for the next 50-some days, in overseeing the implementation of the Space Weather Action Plan. But really, at the end of the day, we undertook this effort to highlight and to continue to drive forward on the important impacts that space weather research and mitigation has and the benefits associated with EMP, including improved electric grid modeling, contingency planning, and the hardening of components. And I want to tell you, one of the most remarkable things that we did as this task force, and I think that this is different than other task forces that have been convened, is that we made sure owners and operators of critical infrastructure were part of this effort. We didn't gather as a federal community and come up with a strategy. Through the FRNs, through a number of meetings that we did, we brought the private sector in both to talk about this particular hazard, but to better understand how it would impact their infrastructures, their systems, and their networks, and what we needed to be doing as a federal government to ensure the resiliency in the event of this type of event. Equally important, our Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis is partnering with the Department of Energy and has funded a project at the Los Alamos National Lab and the Sandia National Lab to analyze the hazard environments, the impacts and consequences of different sources of EMP and GMD on the electric power infrastructure, and to use those methods to determine EMP and GMD events of concern. The study is going to be carried out in 4 phases, each of which will provide higher levels of analytic fidelity. It focuses on those EMP and GMD sources and the events that create significant consequences or whose consequences are sufficiently uncertain, and help guide us in doing additional study. We are also working very closely with DOE in its work to support the development of an EMP strategy in concert with the Electric Power Research Institute. That's EPRI that was alluded to earlier. We are also partnering with other interagency partners to complete work on the Strategic National Risk Assessment as part of the National Preparedness System Refresh. And unclassified summaries of the National Risk Assessment will be released along with other National Preparedness System documents upon review in federal concurrence. In tandem with this effort, EPRI, again, which was mentioned early, is initiating a study of EMP vulnerabilities. It includes the participation of over 35 utilities with $5.4 million in federal R&D funding. This effort and associated funding is important in helping us to better understand the consequences of an EMP attack. And this is where I do want to pause for a minute, because I think the focus that our communities have given on these lower probability but high impact unbounded events has really changed how we are engaging and participating in these efforts. And I think it is worth pointing out that both the federal government but some of our lifeline sectors do take these threats very seriously. 3 days ago, we convened what we call the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. This brings together very senior level policymakers in government with 40 CEOs of the largest electric utilities, public power associations, and rural cooperatives to take on the hard issues. We come together 3 times a year. We've got a work plan that addresses cybersecurity, that addresses information sharing, and that addresses these unbounded threats. So I don't want you to leave here today thinking that we are trying to sweep this under the rug and that we are not taking this seriously. We are very engaged in these efforts. We are working very closely with our industry partners, both to ensure that these threats are well understood, that the consequences are well understood, and that we have a plan that begins to address how we will respond in the event that one of these things happens. Scott is going to talk a little bit more about our PSA program and the support that we provide to the owner and operator community, both in terms of helping understand this complex risk environment, but the tools that we bring. One of the cornerstones of what we do at the Office of Infrastructure Protection is something called a Regional Resilience Assessment Program, where we look at a particular industry and its dependency on lifeline sectors and the threats and hazards that can impact it, and how we come together as a community to ensure the resilience of that industry or that particular sector. We are doing a lot in the electric industry. This is both because of our partnership with industry, but because of the number of both events that we are seeing in cyberspace, because of what we saw out in California and the attack on the Metcalf substation, but also because of these types of unbounded events. And then I think finally it is important to note that we also do take very seriously the work that Congress and GAO has done on this. And in fact, in April of 2016, GAO completed an audit of federal actions around electromagnetic risk. There were 6 recommendations, 4 of which are DHS's, and I will tell you again that we take very seriously our commitment to implement those recommendations. So if there is anything I leave you with today, I hope it is a sense of the commitment of the federal government, of the Department of Homeland Security, and of the Office of Infrastructure Protection to continue to work with our partners, both to manage many of the day-to-day risks that I talk about, but again, these lower frequency, higher impact, unbounded types of events. And I think it is important, again, the partnership that we bring together from all parts of government and from all parts of the private sector. I had an opportunity yesterday to talk to some incoming elected officials and spent much of the time talking about this dynamic threat environment, but also talked about in an election cycle where we have had a lot of conversation about the importance of modernizing our infrastructure, of reinvesting of our infrastructure, recognizing that we've come to the lifespan. The other thing that I think that we need to continue to push is that as we reinvest, as we modernize, as we retrofit, we need to make sure that we are accounting for the world that we know today, but the world that may exist not only in 3 years, but 10 years and 60 years. And so we have to have the security people sitting next to the architects, to the builders and the builders. And so as we engage in this conversation about the need to modernize our infrastructure, this has to be a constant drumbeat, and that is my ask of you. As you interact with members of Congress and others who are thinking about this, make sure that they understand the importance of putting the security folks next to the builders and the architects. So again, thank you very much for your work on this effort. I'm delighted that Scott gets to follow me and tell you a little bit more about how we're actually out there in the states working with owners and operators and state and locals to help them understand this complex environment, the value that a PSA brings to this fight. But I am, again, grateful for the opportunity to address you, to have worked with you for the last 7 years. And as I've said many times over the last couple of weeks, it's not really goodbye, because as I've learned in this world, it is a small world, and I know that our paths will continue to cross. So with that, do you want me to take questions, or are we trying to get back on time? Okay, we're trying to get back on time. Thank you very much.